She was cheated on and laughed at, but then she showed proof that changed everything. Amelia had always believed her marriage was steady, even if not passionate. Daniel was the kind of man who followed a routine down to the minute, same breakfast, same shirts, same news headlines. He wasn't the romantic type, but he was stable, and stability was something Amelia clung to. Her friends admired their life from the outside, the house with white shutters, their 2 cars, the quiet weekends. But what they didn't see were the nights spent in silence, or the way Daniel's phone never left his pocket at home anymore. Something had shifted, yet Amelia wasn't sure when or how. It was in the small things. He no longer asked how her day was. He stopped reaching for her hand during walks. He always had a reason to be late. Still, Amelia pushed aside her doubts, convincing herself that work was just weighing him down. She told herself this was what long-term marriages looked like, comfort without chaos. It wasn't until their 12th anniversary came and went, with no flowers, no words, not even a dinner, that something inside her started to fray. She sat on their porch that evening, sipping cold coffee, staring out into a quiet yard, and wondered if love could disappear without anyone noticing. 3 weeks after the forgotten anniversary, Amelia found herself sitting alone in the living room, staring at her phone screen. Daniel had sent a message saying he'd be working late again, but Amelia noticed something unusual. The message ended with a heart emoji. He had never used one with her, not even when they were dating. A strange chill crept up her spine, but she didn't reply. Instead, she walked upstairs and opened the drawer where Daniel kept his cologne. A new bottle stood there, unopened. It wasn't the brand he used. It wasn't even something she'd ever seen him wear. That same night, when he returned home past midnight, Amelia pretended to be asleep. She heard the soft thud of his shoes being kicked off, the quiet rustling of his clothes. He didn't check on her, didn't kiss her forehead like he used to when he thought she was asleep. He simply climbed into bed, turned away, and began to snore lightly. Amelia lay still, her eyes wide open in the dark. Her thoughts churned in silence. It was no longer a feeling, it was something real, something tangible. The disconnection wasn't mutual. One of them had already left. Amelia had worked part-time at a community art center for years. It was a modest job that paid just enough to cover her hobbies, but it gave her joy. She had never expected to hear anything about Daniel there. But one day, while she was sorting a box of watercolor sets, a coworker named Marla walked in chatting about a corporate lunch at Daniel's company. "He always brings that in turn," Marla whispered to another woman. "Young, tall, always laughing at his jokes. They're a little too close, if you ask me." Amelia froze, paintbrush in hand. She didn't say a word. Later that evening, Amelia sat in her car outside the grocery store and stared at the rain on the windshield. She thought about every time Daniel had brushed off her suggestions to have lunch together, claiming he was swamped or stuck in meetings. Her hands shook as she scrolled through his recent bank transactions on the shared app they still had. There were several charges from upscale restaurants Amelia had never been to. She felt nausea bubble in her chest. She didn't want to believe it. But every detail pointed to a truth she wasn't ready to face. Something was happening behind her back, and it wasn't just emotional distance, it was betrayal. It was an unusually warm afternoon when Amelia decided to clean out Daniel's car. She told herself it was just a way to feel useful, maybe even prove to herself that she was still involved in his life. But as she reached into the glove box to organize the loose papers, her fingers grazed something small and smooth. Pulling it out, she stared at a single earring, silver, studded with a sapphire. She didn't own anything like it. Her breath caught in her throat. She held it in her palm for a long time before quietly putting it back where she found it. That night, Daniel walked into the kitchen, chatting loudly on the phone. Amelia stood behind the doorway, her heart pounding. "Yeah, she didn't notice a thing," he said, laughing. "It's easier than I thought." He walked past her without seeing her, heading to the upstairs bathroom. Amelia stayed frozen in place. Her legs felt like stone. That earring, that laugh, the late nights, they weren't isolated moments. Together, they formed a cruel pattern. Her marriage was no longer real. It was a mask, and underneath it, everything she had trusted was crumbling. But she said nothing. Not yet. Daniel insisted on dragging Amelia to his company's spring gala. She wore a simple black dress, one that used to make her feel elegant. But that night, it felt like armor. As they entered the grand ballroom, Daniel didn't introduce her to anyone. He floated through groups with his drink, laughing too hard, standing too close to a woman in a red dress who fit the exact image Amelia had formed in her head. The woman glanced over and whispered something to Daniel, who laughed and looked directly at Amelia, unashamed. Later, as Amelia stood alone near the hors d'oeuvres, she overheard two colleagues whispering behind her. "Isn't that his wife? Poor thing. Everyone knows he's been seeing Sophie." Amelia kept her gaze fixed on the shrimp cocktail in her hand. She didn't flinch, didn't cry. She had become invisible, an ornament in Daniel's public success story. But deep inside, something was beginning to stir. Not rage, not sorrow. Something colder. More precise. She would not be the woman laughed at. Not for much longer. Amelia hadn't planned to confront him. But after days of silence, she asked Daniel if they could talk. He rolled his eyes but agreed, barely looking up from his phone. They sat across from each other at the dining table, the same one where they once shared coffee and quiet Sunday mornings. She asked him if something had changed, if there was someone else. He exhaled, leaning back in his chair with an expression that was both bored and annoyed. "You're just not enough anymore," he said plainly. "You don't challenge me. You don't excite me. Sophie, she makes me feel alive again." Amelia sat still, her face flushed but unreadable. She waited for a punchline that didn't come. He wasn't apologizing, nor trying to hide it. He had said it like it was a fact, as casual as discussing the weather. Her heart ached, but her pride stayed seated. She nodded once, got up, and walked out of the room, leaving Daniel to sip his wine in silence. The days that followed were strangely calm. Daniel avoided her entirely, and Amelia found herself moving through the house like a guest. She stopped cooking dinner, stopped asking if he was coming home. She slept on the couch most nights, pretending it was for comfort, but really it was because the bed no longer felt like hers. Even the family photo on the mantel looked staged now, a performance of happiness that never quite existed. She started keeping a notebook, writing down every moment that hurt, not because she wanted to remember, but because she needed to understand. Why she had ignored the signs. Why she had held on so tightly to something so hollow. The house, once filled with familiar routines and soft footsteps, had become a museum of denial. Amelia realized she wasn't mourning the loss of her marriage, she was mourning the years she spent pretending it was enough. 2 weeks later, Daniel announced he was filing for divorce. He said it quickly, over breakfast, while checking his phone. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he added. "It'll be straightforward." Amelia nodded as if he had said something mundane. She didn't cry, didn't ask for a reason. Her silence unsettled him. That night, he packed a few things and moved out. He didn't say goodbye. The door closed, and with it, 12 years of her life became history. For hours, Amelia sat in the empty kitchen, staring at the untouched tea he left on the table. She had always imagined divorce would come with screaming or slamming doors, not quiet indifference. But maybe that was the final insult, not even worth the drama. She picked up his cup, washed it, and placed it neatly in the cupboard. Not out of habit, but because she knew it would be the last time she ever did. On the day of the divorce hearing, Amelia dressed simply and arrived early. Daniel was late but smug, walking in with Sophie at his side, dressed like she was attending a gala. The courtroom was modest, but the air was thick with whispers and side glances. Daniel's lawyer leaned over and whispered something that made him laugh. Amelia could feel the burn of eyes on her, not with sympathy, but pity. During the proceedings, Daniel made a cruel remark about Amelia's lack of contribution to the marriage. His lawyer suggested she was emotionally unstable and unmotivated. Sophie smirked in the back row. Amelia remained composed, though her cheeks burned. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, Amelia simply replied, "No, Your Honor." Not because she had nothing, but because she knew the time for explanations was over. This wasn't a battle she needed to win. Not here. Amelia moved into a modest studio apartment on the other side of town. The walls were bare, and the floor creaked, but it was hers. She bought second-hand furniture, cooked simple meals, and breathed in a kind of silence that felt healing. There were no more footsteps overhead, no more late-night phone buzzes. Just her, the hum of the refrigerator, and the ticking of a clock that no longer counted down to someone else's arrival. At first, the loneliness was unbearable. She would wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for someone who was no longer there. But slowly, something began to shift. She rearranged the furniture one morning just because she could. She started lighting candles in the evening. The quiet, once heavy, began to feel sacred. This space didn't carry memories. It didn't judge her or remind her of what she'd lost. For the first time in years, Amelia began to feel like herself again. Amelia had taken a job at a local art supply store. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept her busy, and the quiet hum of creativity around her was oddly comforting. One afternoon, while restocking brushes, she noticed a customer had forgotten a sketchbook at the counter. Curiosity got the better of her. She flipped it open, expecting scribbles or rough shapes, but instead found pages filled with intricate drawings of people, ordinary people, captured in extraordinary detail. On the final page, her breath caught. There she was, drawn from the side, seated on a bench near the shop, looking lost in thought. It wasn't just the likeness, it was the way the artist had captured the sadness in her eyes, the slight slump of her shoulders. It was intimate, almost invasive, yet hauntingly beautiful. Tucked into the last page was a note, "You don't know me, but you've been the face of calm in my storm. Thank you for existing." Amelia stared at the page, her hands trembling slightly. It had been so long since anyone had seen her, truly seen her, that the feeling was almost too much. For the first time in months, she smiled. That evening, Amelia sat at her kitchen table with the sketchbook open, the letter beside her. It was handwritten in clean script, filled with quiet admiration. The artist, a man named Julian, wrote about how he'd noticed her over the past few weeks, always alone, always thoughtful, always present in the moment. "You reminded me that silence can be strong," one line read. Amelia read it twice, then a third time. Something about the honesty in the letter soothed her. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't pity. It was respect, pure and quiet, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, Julian returned to the store, flustered and apologetic. He hadn't realized he'd left the sketchbook until hours later. When Amelia handed it back, he seemed embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be invasive," he said. She reassured him, smiling softly. "You weren't." That moment felt like a thread pulling two disconnected lives into the same direction. Julian lingered a few minutes longer, talking about art, the weather, and eventually asking if he could show her more of his work sometime. She said yes, surprising herself with how easy it felt. Julian began stopping by the shop more often, always with a quiet greeting and a kind smile. Sometimes, he'd bring coffee. Other times, new drawings. Their conversations stayed light, favorite books, local exhibits, the way autumn leaves looked against the concrete. Amelia found herself laughing more, leaning into the calm that Julian carried like a second skin. He never pried, never asked about her past. He simply treated her like someone who mattered, and that, more than anything, made her want to stay present. One Saturday, Julian invited her to an art show at a small gallery downtown. He admitted it wasn't anything fancy, but a few of his pieces were on display, and he'd like her to see them. Amelia hesitated for only a second before agreeing. That night, as she stepped into the warm, softly lit space, she was overwhelmed by the vibrant energy of the place, and then by something even stronger. On the far wall, under a gentle spotlight, was a drawing of her. Titled Resilience, it showed her sitting quietly, hands clasped, eyes closed, peaceful, not broken. She stood in front of it for a long time, unsure whether to cry or breathe. As autumn deepened, Amelia found herself waking up excited for the first time in years. She had begun painting again, something she hadn't touched since college. The colors on the canvas spoke to parts of her that words couldn't reach. Julian had given her a set of oil pastels as a quiet gift, saying simply, "I think your hands remember more than your mind does." He was right. With each stroke, she remembered how it felt to create without expectation, just for herself. It wasn't about being good. It was about being whole. They started meeting regularly at a small cafe between their neighborhoods. Julian never pushed, never asked more than she was willing to share. But in the quiet pauses, the gentle smiles, Amelia felt the safety to open up. One afternoon, she told him about the divorce. She didn't speak with bitterness, just clarity. Julian listened without interruption, his eyes warm but unreadable. "You're still here," he said when she finished. "That says more than anything." And in that moment, Amelia realized joy wasn't something you chased. It was something that returned when you stopped running from yourself. It had been weeks since Amelia had thought about Daniel. She didn't avoid it, she just didn't feel the need anymore. That changed when she walked into her usual cafe with Julian and heard a familiar voice behind her. Daniel. He was standing near the counter, holding hands with Sophie. Amelia's heart didn't race. Instead, a strange calm settled over her. She turned slightly, enough for him to see her. His expression shifted from smug to stunned in seconds. She looked radiant, soft waves in her hair, a scarf loosely tied, laughter still lingering from whatever Julian had just said. Sophie whispered something to Daniel, but his eyes stayed locked on Amelia. She met his gaze only for a moment before turning back to Julian, who hadn't noticed the shift in energy. "Ready to order?" he asked, and Amelia smiled. "Absolutely." As they sat at a table near the window, she saw Daniel pass by again, this time slower, almost unsure. But she didn't look up. That chapter was closed. And as she laughed at Julian's story about a disastrous art class he once taught, Amelia felt something deep and simple settle in her chest, the peace that comes when you no longer need to be seen by those who once refused to see you. Julian invited Amelia to another small exhibition, this time featuring young emerging artists. She hesitated at first, unsure if she belonged in that space. But he insisted. Art doesn't belong to anyone. It welcomes everyone, he said gently. That night, as they walked together through the crowded gallery, Amelia found herself drawn to a corner where a familiar sketch hung. It was a variation of resilience, this time in color. It drew quiet attention, sparking soft murmurs from those nearby. Amelia stood silently, watching strangers engage with a version of herself she was only just beginning to recognize. A woman leaned in and asked Julian, "Who's your muse?" He glanced toward Amelia, his eyes warm but calm. "Someone who survived more than she'll ever tell you," he replied. Amelia smiled without turning. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't hiding. She felt seen, not as the woman who'd been left behind, but as someone who had risen from it. After the show, Julian took her hand as they walked outside. She didn't pull away. The night air felt cold, but something inside her was glowing with a quiet, steady warmth that couldn't be touched. The next day, photos from the gallery began to surface online. A local arts blog posted a piece on the event, and Amelia's portrait made it into the headline banner. It didn't take long for someone in Daniel's social circle to notice. That afternoon, Sophie posted a not-so-subtle message on social media, "Never thought Dole could be inspiring." Amelia saw it by chance when a friend sent her a screenshot. She stared at the words, waiting for the sting, but there was none. Only a strange amusement. The need for revenge faded when you stopped needing validation. Amelia didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any response. Still, the whispers reached Daniel. Colleagues mentioned the portrait. Some asked if it was really his ex-wife. Others complimented the artwork, noting how composed and magnetic she looked. The comments began to chip at Daniel's confidence. He had expected Amelia to vanish into quiet shame, not to become a symbol of strength. Sophie, sensing his discomfort, scoffed. "You still care?" she asked. Daniel said nothing, but something in his eyes faltered. Amelia, meanwhile, had moved on, not to prove him wrong, but because she no longer cared if he noticed. Amelia was organizing art supplies at work when her phone vibrated. The name on the screen froze her in place, Daniel. For a second, she considered letting it ring. But then curiosity took over. She answered with a quiet, firm hello. His voice was hesitant, softer than she remembered. He asked if they could meet. Just to talk, he added quickly. She didn't respond right away, then finally agreed. They arranged to meet at the park near their old house, a place once filled with shared Sunday mornings and silent walks after arguments. When she arrived, Daniel was already there, sitting on the familiar bench. He looked older, tired, not in a physical way, but like someone worn down by small, accumulating regrets. They talked for a while, mostly surface level. He tried to joke, to reminisce, but Amelia remained neutral. Then, without warning, he asked if she was seeing someone. She gave a small nod, nothing more. "You look different," he said. "Happier." She met his eyes for a long moment and replied, "That's because I am." He didn't argue. He just looked away, his silence saying more than he ever had during their marriage. Daniel tried to steer the conversation back toward the past, but Amelia gently redirected it. She didn't want to relive what was already done. She told him she had found peace, that she no longer held resentment. "You gave me the quiet I needed to hear myself again," she said. He blinked, unsure if it was a compliment or a condemnation. She stood to leave, but before walking away, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "I think you should see this," she said, placing it beside him on the bench. Inside were papers, neatly organized bank statements, invoices, and photos of a studio space with her name on the lease. The last item was a copy of a business card, Amelia Lorne, independent artist and consultant. Daniel flipped through the documents, his face tightening with each page. "You planned all this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia gave him a tired smile. "No. Life did. I just stopped standing still long enough to let it happen." She walked away without looking back, her heels quiet on the pavement, but her presence echoing louder than ever. Later that evening, Amelia sat at her apartment desk, staring at the second copy of the envelope she had given Daniel. It represented more than financial freedom, it was proof of her autonomy, of the life she had rebuilt with quiet defiance. With Julian's encouragement, she had turned her sketches and paintings into a brand. Clients began commissioning work. A local magazine published a short profile on her journey. And slowly, her name started to mean something, not as Daniel's ex-wife, but as an artist who painted strength from silence. Daniel, meanwhile, sat in his high-rise condo with the envelope still unopened beside him. He hadn't shown it to Sophie. He wasn't sure why, but something about Amelia's calm unnerved him. He had expected bitterness, maybe a plea for reconciliation. Instead, he got clarity. And clarity, he realized, was more powerful than any argument. As he stared out at the skyline, he felt something unfamiliar, regret that had nowhere to go. Amelia had walked away, not out of spite, but because she had finally remembered who she was, and who he never allowed her to be. A week after their meeting, Amelia received a message from an old coworker. Attached was a video clip, a snippet from the courtroom during her divorce. Daniel's voice was clearly heard mocking her, followed by laughter from his lawyer. The video had somehow leaked online, posted anonymously to a blog focused on exposing unethical divorce behavior. Within hours, it spread. The public reaction was swift, with hundreds of comments sympathizing with Amelia. People called out the cruelty, the arrogance, and something else she hadn't expected, admiration for her silent composure. The comments poured in, she held her dignity when she was being torn apart, this woman didn't need to fight back, her silence was power. Amelia was stunned, unsure how to process the sudden attention. Julian found the video as well and simply texted, "The world is seeing what I already knew." Amelia stared at the clip, her own still face frozen on screen while Daniel sneered beside her. It was a reminder not of her pain, but of her endurance. And this time, people were watching, and finally, they understood. The next time Daniel tried to call, Amelia didn't answer. He texted instead, "Can we meet again?" She didn't reply. Days later, he showed up at the art store. He stood quietly near the entrance, unsure of his place. When she noticed him, she paused, then approached calmly. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, eyes low. She nodded. "Okay." He looked confused, as if waiting for more. "Is that it?" he asked. She met his gaze. "Yes. I don't need more than that. You're late, but at least now I know you can feel something." He shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to defend himself or stay quiet. "You didn't deserve how I treated you," he finally said. "I know," Amelia replied. She didn't say it cruelly. It was just a fact now, like gravity. He left without asking for another chance. He knew better. Outside, he looked back once through the glass, seeing her chatting with a customer, smiling, fully present in a life he was no longer part of. That, more than any scolding or argument, was what humbled him the most, that she no longer needed closure. She had already moved on. Amelia's story began circulating on larger platforms. Her artwork, especially Resilience, gained traction across social media. One day, a journalist from a digital magazine reached out, asking to interview her about her journey from divorce to artistic rebirth. She hesitated but agreed, setting boundaries around what she was willing to share. The interview was simple, heartfelt. She didn't dramatize anything, didn't paint herself as a victim. She just spoke of learning how to listen to herself again, how silence could rebuild you from the inside out. The article was published with the headline, "From Ashes to Art, A Woman's Quiet Rebirth." Thousands of shares followed. But what touched Amelia most were the private messages from women around the country. "Your story gave me courage. I saw myself in your silence. I left him after reading this." She read them in the dim light of her apartment, tears quietly falling down her cheeks, not from pain, but from purpose. Her suffering had become something bigger than her. And this time, her voice, even in quiet, had finally been heard. Julian proposed the idea gently. "Why don't we do another show? But this time, your work." Amelia hesitated. "Me?" He nodded. "Yes. Your story. Your art. Your eyes." The thought both terrified and excited her. For weeks, she painted with urgency, not for therapy but for expression. Each canvas held fragments of her journey, the isolation, the doubt, the rediscovery. The night of the exhibit, the gallery was filled with soft light and people who didn't know her past, only the strength her art revealed. Daniel showed up near the end. He stayed in the back, unnoticed. When he saw the painting titled The Bench, her sitting with her back straight, a faint smirk on her lips, he knew it was the moment she had left him emotionally. There was no anger in her work, only truth. Guests moved slowly, reading descriptions, absorbing color and silence together. Amelia stood near the entrance, watching as strangers connected with parts of her life she had once hidden. And this time, she felt no shame. Only clarity. Daniel approached her quietly after most guests had left. He wasn't smug anymore. Just small. "I thought you were the weak one," he said, almost whispering. Amelia tilted her head. "You did," she answered. "But you were wrong." He looked around at the paintings. "You didn't just move on. You built something." She looked at him, no longer bitter or even hurt. "You couldn't break what you never bothered to understand." He nodded slowly, unable to argue. The man who once believed silence meant defeat now stood before the woman who had transformed it into her armor, and then into her weapon. As he walked out of the gallery, Amelia didn't follow with her eyes. She turned instead to greet a young woman complimenting her painting. "Thank you," Amelia said warmly. And in her voice, there was no trace of the past, only the echo of a woman who had survived it. The success of Amelia's exhibit opened new doors. Invitations arrived from women's networks, small art collectives, and community events. But the one that struck her most was a letter from a high school inviting her to speak. "We'd love for our girls to hear from someone who found strength in silence." At first, she hesitated. She didn't see herself as someone with wisdom to offer. But when she stood in that small auditorium, looking out at rows of young, curious faces, her fear vanished. She began not with drama, but with a quiet truth: "I thought silence meant weakness. I was wrong." She spoke not of Daniel or betrayal, but of forgetting who she was, and the journey of remembering. The students listened, wide-eyed and still. One girl raised her hand and asked, "Did it hurt to be alone?" Amelia nodded gently. "Yes. But healing started when I stopped fearing my own company." That evening, she received dozens of thank you notes, many handwritten. She kept them all in a box by her bed, not as trophies, but as reminders of the power that can bloom when a woman finds her voice again. Amelia's world began expanding in ways she hadn't expected. She joined a collective of female artists, helped organize workshops for survivors of emotional abuse, and even mentored 2 teenage girls exploring art therapy. Each day felt purposeful, not because of applause, but because she had turned her pain into something useful. People didn't come to her out of pity. They came because her stillness had become a mirror, reflecting parts of themselves they had long buried. One afternoon, she sat across from Julian in their favorite cafe. He looked at her with a soft smile and said, "You've changed more lives than you know." She lowered her eyes, stirring her tea. "Sometimes I wonder if it all had to happen just to get me here." Julian leaned closer. "Maybe. But either way, you didn't let it define you. You made it yours." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her story was no longer a wound. It had become a foundation. Weeks passed before Daniel reached out again. This time, it wasn't a call or an unexpected visit. It was a single message, long and carefully written. He spoke of regret, of reflection, of how he had confused dominance for value and silence for submission. "I miss the peace I had with you," the final line read. Amelia read it once, twice, then set the phone down. She didn't reply. She knew he wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was asking for what she had found, and that was something she had earned alone. That night, she wrote a journal entry. "Forgiveness doesn't mean returning what was broken. It means walking away without dragging it behind you." She didn't block Daniel. She didn't curse his name. She simply let go of the rope he had once used to bind her. And in that release, she found something far more valuable than revenge. She found peace that didn't depend on anyone else's remorse. A year passed quietly. Amelia's business grew, but not rapidly, steadily, like roots under the surface. She traveled to 3 cities to exhibit her new series, Stillness Speaks, and collaborated with therapists to bring art into healing spaces. But on a sunny afternoon, she did something far simpler. She walked alone to the old park near her former home, the same one where Daniel had once tried to measure her growth with an apology. She sat on the familiar bench, the air warm around her, her hands clasped in her lap. Around her, families passed, joggers moved with purpose, and the world went on. But in Amelia's heart, there was only stillness, not the stillness of being stuck, but the stillness of clarity. She had rebuilt her life, not out of spite, but out of truth. And truth, she had learned, didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be consistent. She closed her eyes, smiled, and for the first time in years, felt no weight on her chest. Just air. Just freedom. Amelia returned home and stood in front of her easel. A blank canvas waited. No story to finish. No audience to impress. Just a new beginning. She didn't sketch right away. She brewed tea, opened her windows, and let the breeze roll in. She stood barefoot on the floor of her studio, the evening sun painting soft shadows across her workspace. There was no soundtrack, no climax, only life, lived slowly and fully, on her terms. She dipped her brush into the first color, a pale golden hue. Not loud. Not flashy. But luminous. As the first stroke crossed the canvas, she felt it, the quiet joy of creation not born from pain, but from peace. This wasn't a return to who she was before. It was the rise of who she had always been meant to be. And in that moment, Amelia knew, not just in her mind, but deep in her bones, that sometimes, the most powerful kind of revenge is happiness.